The fundamental problem is the competitiveness problem. This inflationary credit bubble deprived the southern European countries of their competitiveness. They simply became too expensive. Any country in the world can be competitive, regardless of its productivity, if the living standard follows the productivity. But if the living standard is above the productivity, you have a competitiveness problem. That's the simple message. The euro brought cheap credit to Southern Europe and made it possible to develop wages beyond productivity for the reasons I explained. And that turned out to be a problem. The problem became really severe when about 10 years, 9 years after the Madrid summit, there was the Eastern enlargement of the EU, which brought lots of low-wage competitors into the labor market. Here you see the labor costs per hour worked in manufacturing in the Eastern European countries. And here you have our 6 crisis countries. They are obviously all here on the upper end. And if you compare, for example, Poland with Greece, you see that Greece is exactly twice as expensive as Poland. Now think of the choice of an investor whether to open a factory in Greece or in Poland. What will he do? Greece would have to have a labor productivity twice as high as the Polish one, a potential labor productivity, so to say, for investors to materialize, for this to be an equilibrium. But I do not see the slightest indicator that this could be the case, rather the opposite. Or compare Poland with Spain. Spain is more than 3 times as expensive as Poland. Do they have a labor productivity 3 times as high as Poland, or even higher than Poland? I don't know. This is the fundamental problem of Southern Europe. And nothing what politicians in Brussels, in Berlin, or in these countries may say, or what the ECB might argue, will be able to change that in the short run. It is not possible with Keynesian demand measurement or with monetary policy to overcome this problem. You can mitigate the pain, you can artificially create some demand by pouring money at these economies, but is that a solution? Should the Spanish state buy SEAT automobiles by allowing the state to borrow in the market? No, this is just painkillers, but certainly nothing that cures the disease. Another view on the same thing, which is actually more accurate than just looking at wages, because productivity also comes into the picture, is prices. You could also look at unit labor costs, but we know from the German debate 10 years ago that this is fallacious. If countries go into unemployment, they cut off the less productive jobs first, and the labor productivity goes up and unit labor costs improve, even though nothing has happened. So unit labor costs would have to be corrected for the change in employment to be good measures, but that is never being done. So let's rather look at the price level, and here the GDP deflator, not the consumer price index, because that would include imports, would be the wrong indicator. We call that real exchange rates. These are the price levels of the self-produced goods relative to the respective rest of the Eurozone. Okay? And everything is normalized such that at the time of Lehman it becomes 1. I show you different countries, different time paths of countries. Here you have Spain. Spain started at 80 and went to 100, meaning that the relative price level went up by 25%. It is as if they still had the peseta and revalued the peseta by 25%. Now, when I was a student, we learned lots of things about the Bretton Woods system. And I still remember when our teachers spoke about the year 1961, when Germany's Deutschmark appreciated by 5%. Then the industry was alarmed and said this cannot happen because we will go bankrupt, we will never survive the 5%. That was the argument at the time. And here we have 25%. That has killed the Spanish industry and manufacturing sector. Now, in order to regain the competitiveness, Spain would have to reduce the prices again. But where? Back to the same level? Is that enough? Actually, for the specialists, there could be other elements in it, like the ratio of traded goods prices and so on, but I checked that in my book and discuss it, so I don't want to go into the details here. So it basically is an inflationary bubble, what we see here, and in order to regain competitiveness, one would have to go down to 80%. Yes, indeed, Spain is coming down. There has been a devaluation throughout the crisis of 6% now. There was wage moderation, there was price moderation in Spain, something has happened. But is that enough? And is it enough to return to the 80? There is a study by Goldman Sachs, the economics department of Goldman Sachs, who asked the question, how much devaluation would be necessary to bring the net foreign debt position of a country below 25% of GDP? That is to create debt sustainability. And don't forget, during this period, Spain borrowed a lot. They built up a huge net foreign debt which needs to be serviced. So we need a further devaluation to create a corresponding trade surplus to compensate for the net interest burden. This is their calculation. That's the level where Spain would have to go. Again, not to be confused for the specialists, Goldman Sachs says 30% relative to the average. Since the Eurostat data are not relative to the average, but relative to the rest of the Eurozone, we recalculated it, and then it's 34% decline. Yes, it's a long way. They are on the right track, but it's a long way. An older colleague of mine who had studied the Bretton Woods area thoroughly in his research period told me that a realignment in a currency union might take a generation. Just to give you a feeling. I don't know whether he's right or wrong, but just to give you a feeling for the kind of problem we are having. It has nothing whatsoever to do with a business cycle problem. And here we have Greece, similar development. We have Portugal, similar. Greece also devalued by 6%. Portugal has not yet devalued by any sizable amount. Here we have France. To my surprise, that study says that France would even have to devalue by 20% against the average, 24% against the rest of the Eurozone. These numbers differ more the larger an economy is. Why? Probably because France always had a competitiveness problem and because they have a growing current account deficit. This is Italy, only for me also surprisingly moderate devaluation of 11%, but given that Italy appreciated a lot during the euro, that this is a bit surprising. But by and large, the situation is similar in these countries. Here we have Ireland. Ireland did its job. It depreciated enough, or it devalued its price level enough relative to the others, And you see the depreciation began in 2006 already, because that was the point when the bubble burst. You remember the property prices had their peak also in 2006 in the previous graph. And here we have Germany. Germany became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper relative to the others. Not that the wages or prices declined. No, the wages never declined, let alone the prices. We always had some inflation, but the inflation was less than in the rest of the Eurozone. So it was a relative devaluation in real terms. And in order for Southern Europe to regain its competitiveness, they not only would have to come down with their prices, but also Germany would have to go up by 30% relative to the rest of the Eurozone. All these rebalancing acts are necessary to bring the whole system into an equilibrium again. Why Ireland? Why has Ireland done so much devaluation? This is 15% from the peak in 2006 until now. Ireland is the only country that had a sizable and early devaluation. My interpretation is because no one was helping them. Their bubble burst 2 years before Lehman, and there was no rescue program, no special program of the ECB buying time or anything. So they had to go the austerity way, tighten their belt, reducing their wages and their prices. And that was hard, but it helped. And that, in my interpretation, is the explanation for this enormous success of Ireland, which I've shown you in terms of industrial production, 20% plus from the last year to this year. But why only Ireland? Why not the others? Well, because the others, as I will explain, alleviated the pain of being shut off from the capital market by printing the money which they couldn't borrow. Everyone has a printing press in the basement, in a sense, and has possibilities under the rules of the ECB to issue more money to local banks than is needed for local circulation. That alleviated the pain, but it also meant that the real devaluation did not take place. Because such a devaluation you only do under pain. It means wage cuts. You have to fight the unions. You have to fight against the resistance of wage earners. It's a very difficult thing. And if there is another possibility, the resistance will be so large that you can never do it. There are now 4 dismal options. Given that our discipline is one which is called the dismal science, it may be appropriate to speak about 4 dismal options. So, things which we can do, but which are not really satisfactory, because there are always problems. And since they are all 4 dismal options, I think the title which I gave my book, Euro Trap, is appropriate. The first one is we go into a transfer union. That is, the lack of competitiveness continues to be financed, no longer with private capital inflows into the southern countries, but now with public capital inflows. Credit operations through public institutions, let it be the ECB or rescue funds or what have you. And these credit flows you can call initially credit flows, but over time they will be converted into open transfers because the interest rates are driven down to 0, the maturities are extended more and more, and then what is called a credit becomes indistinguishable from an outright transfer. This is very expensive because 40% of the Eurozone population lives in these countries, including Italy. 60 would have to finance 40. In Germany, we tried such a solution with East Germany, and still each year pay 60 billion euros in net terms from west to east. But there we had 80 Westerners confronting 20 Easterners. It was somehow easier. Above that, the transfer is not only beneficial for the recipient regions, because it drives them into a Dutch disease. The Netherlands in the 60s found gas, sold the gas, had lots of money, used the money to increase the wages, which killed the export industry. As you know, in our discipline there are hundreds and hundreds of papers about the Dutch disease. East Germany clearly is in a Dutch disease, as IFO Dresden has recently documented. From 1995 onwards, there was no convergence anymore. West Germany grew by 27%, East Germany only by 20%. And the East German GDP per capita is fixed at 66% of the Western level, of which 3 percentage points are exclusively due to the artificial wage increase in the government sector, which is counted as an increase in GDP according to our accounting standards. So that's the first possibility. The second one is we deflate the periphery through austerity. A bit is possible, as Ireland has shown, but is the amount of austerity possible which countries like Greece or Spain would need in order to regain their competitiveness by reducing the wages and prices? I doubt, for one simple reason. They came into the problem because of the excessive borrowing. Now the households are over indebted, and if we cut their wages and prices, then they would not be able to service this debt, because we cannot simultaneously cut the debt. The same is true for companies which are over indebted. They would be driven into bankruptcy. So there is mass unemployment and insolvency. Actually, exactly the terrors which Keynes in his letter to Churchill in the 20s described, warning Churchill to return to the gold standard. Churchill nevertheless went to the gold standard, and in 31 Britain had to escape the gold standard again, because it was impossible to carry out the necessary devaluation inside a fixed exchange rate setting. Germany, on the other hand, at that time could not escape the gold standard, because the reparations were fixed in Reichsmark, whose exchange rate to gold was fixed. And therefore, Brüning had to push through a process of real devaluation with enormous austerity. The prices went down by 22-23% from 29 to 33, and the wages even by 28%. And you know, this was the recipe of bringing Germany to the brink of a civil war. What came in 33 was even worse. So while it would be useful to deflate, to regain competitiveness, the debt problem is hardly surmountable. Third, we inflate the core, Germany and similar countries. But according to the previous calculations, how much would the German price level have to increase if we wanted to make the southern European countries competitive without having absolute price reductions there? The answer is 70%. That would be 5.5% inflation for 10 years, or would increase the average Eurozone inflation rate to 3.6%, certainly violating the mandate of the ECB. Apart from that, even if we were willing to accept this solution, how do you make an inflation when the interest rate is zero and you are in a liquidity trap? So the powder could be used already, and it might be very difficult to find such a solution, even if you were allowed to take it. And the fourth is exit. Exit is very ugly because there will be immediately a bank run when you begin talking about it. There will be capital flight, all these terrible things which we have seen in Cyprus. And the result is that you need capital controls. We now have 2 euros in the Eurozone, not only one. One is in prison in Cyprus, and the other one is in freedom. And the imprisoned Cyprus costs only 80 cents for the euro. That's the current exchange rate. So certainly not an attractive solution. There is no more solutions than these 4, because everything you could dream up in terms of reforms and what the politicians talk about is all a subset of these possibilities. If you carry out productivity-enhancing reforms, you have the possibility of cut your prices if the wages stay constant, for example. No? This is a deflationary possibility. Yes, to some extent we can do that. Ireland also has shown it. But the unions would have to stop then. Usually unions want higher wages if the productivity increases. Unless you change the whole wage settlement system, you will not achieve anything with just increasing productivity. I still will come up with a policy conclusion from this talk later on. It will involve a muddling through, doing a little bit of everything what you see here, plus something extra. A little bit of transfer union, a little bit of deflation like Ireland, a little bit of inflation in Germany, and a little bit of exit.